You like to think of yourself as this independent person where your thoughts and beliefs are your own. But in fact, so many of the things that you think, so many of your values and ideas come from the group. We are more conformist than we imagine, and I include myself in that. If we belong to a certain political tribe, we tend to absorb all of the ideas, the same ideas as other people that have the same political beliefs. So we're much more conformists than we like to believe. And the other thing is that if we're not careful, the kind of group mentality can turn easily into a mob mentality and can become quite dangerous, as happens in like bubbles like the South Sea bubble, etc. So the solution that I'm promoting here is you need to be aware of how deeply the group has infected your own behavior and infected your belief system so that you can create a bit of space for some independent thinking. So you can begin to realize that maybe you don't want to have some of these ideas. They're not coming from within. And the second thing is, if you're a leader of any kind of group in any way, you must be very aware of the prevailing culture. You must be able to read it and understand it and work with it. So if you're starting a group, you're starting a business, if you have a startup of some sort, you have the chance to create a culture. And it's extremely important because once a culture is created, like in Microsoft or American Apparel, it's very hard to change it. So I talk in the book about how to create a healthy, functional, what I call a reality group, as opposed to a dysfunctional group. So that's sort of the lesson there. The last sort of force that I wanted to talk about is related to this group force. And basically, all of us belong to one enormous group that is millions, hundreds of millions, that includes hundreds of millions of people. And that group is the generation that we belong to. A generation basically comprises 22 years. It's called a cohort. So you belong to a particular generation, as I do. And obviously in that 22-year span, the people born near the beginning of that generation, the people born near the end, there's going to be some differences. But social scientists have discovered remarkable similarities between people within a generation, even those that are separated by those years. They'll have similar tastes, similar sense of humor, similar values, similar ideas. Where does this come from? Well, in my book, I make a very kind of intricate description of the origin of the generation and why it evolves that way. But very simply put, when you're young, you're very vulnerable to the emotions and moods and ideas of the people around you. And those of your own age, you're all watching, back in the day when people did that, you're all watching the same television shows. You're all listening to more or less the same music. You're all dealing with parents who came from their own generation, who have their own different special parenting styles, on and on. You're absorbing this kind of group osmosis, this group personality that kind of determines who you are. And this will be the same for millennials, for baby boomers, for Gen Xers. It's kind of like a secret club that you belong to. So people who are millennials, you have a kind of a tacit understanding. I could never enter this club. I could never really completely understand your mentality because it's something that you only from within the generation that you understand. And there are two things that you have to see about the generation phenomenon. First is every generation thinks that it's vastly superior to the one that came before it and vastly superior to the one that comes after. One of the most ancient forms of writing that we have is a Sumerian tablet in which it's quoted, quote, this is from 1000 BC, mind you, today's youth is rotten, evil, godless, and lazy. It will never be what youth used to be, and it will never be able to preserve our culture, end quote. Now that sounds pretty familiar, right? So, you know, people will say of millennials, oh, you're so soft, you're so pampered, you know, what's wrong with you? But people were saying the same thing about baby boomers and saying about the same thing about Gen Xers. It's human nature. So the next time you hear somebody sort of parade this kind of superiority, which I just basically consider generational narcissism. Just tell yourself, it's human nature. People are going to be saying that 1,000 years from now. The second thing you must understand is that the generational phenomenon creates what is called a zeitgeist, a spirit of the times that's critical, absolutely critical for you to understand if you want to be successful in business or whatever. The zeitgeist, basically, at any one time, there are 4 generations that are alive. The 22 years, there might be a 5th generation, but they're getting pretty old and they're dying off. So the 2 youngest generations are the ones that are kind of unsettled. They don't like the way the world is. They want to change it. They want to create new values, new fashions, new styles. They're generating all of this energy for change. The 2 older generations want to stop that. They want to hold on to the past. They want to conserve and preserve the traditions that they inherited. And these 2 seismic forces are continually clashing, creating a spirit of the time, a zeitgeist. The other thing is with generations is they follow this incredible pattern that people have discovered, have written about for many years. So there will be a generation that will be known as the revolutionary generation, in which it overturns all of the previous ideas and values and creates a true revolution. This will be followed by a generation that tries to preserve that revolution and kind of turn it into something a little more rational and sane. This will be followed by a very conservative generation that has lost touch with the revolution, but it's just basically all about safety and keeping what happened in the past. This will be followed by a crisis generation, which gets so sick of the stagnant situation and of the values they've inherited that they're very unhappy and dissatisfied. And this leads to the revolutionary generation, on and on and on and on and on. And we can see this cycle continually happening. And people estimate that the generation that is now, like the millennial generation, is a true crisis generation. And I believe that's true. And that what is following is that we're on the verge of another kind of revolution, the kind that happens, they estimate, every 80 or so years, where values are going to be completely overturned and something new is gestating, something very exciting and something very different. And so your task, whatever you're creating or whatever you're doing, you have an audience that you must reach. And that audience has a zeitgeist, has a spirit. And this spirit is never stagnant. It's always changing. And you tend to be locked in the past. I like to tend the spirit of the times as a kind of a wave. If you're just behind that wave, if you're not quite up to it, the product, the book that you write, the startup that you create will fail. If it's with that wave, if it's riding with it, you will have some success. If you anticipate that wave, if you're a little bit ahead of it, you will have tremendous success. That is where true power lies. So you must be incredibly sensitive to this phenomenon and not be, your generation will tend to lock you into the past, lock you into certain values and belief systems. You want to let go of them. You want to develop some flow. And you want to be able to develop this kind of very sensitive antennae to what is going on with the younger generations where true change is fomenting. Now, I've gone way over my talk, what I thought this would take. But I want to conclude with a story that I have in my book that sort of illustrates to me the tremendous power that you can have by putting these ideas into action. And it's a story about another Englishman. Don't worry, this book isn't just about English people. A man named Sir Ernest Henry Shackleton. He was one of the great English explorers. He lived in the beginning of the 20th century. Shackleton had led several expeditions across Antarctica. And it was his idea that he would lead the first expedition, the first group of men, to cross this enormous continent on foot. So in 1914, he set out with a crew of 27 men to accomplish this. But as they got nearer to the point where they were to embark and cross the continent, they got trapped in an ice floe. And they were trapped in there for months, and their ship started catching water and began to sink. So he had to order all of his men off the ship and onto this ice floe. And they managed to keep a couple of the life preserve ship, the little lifeboats that were on the boat. But basically, Shackleton was now facing what seemed to be an impossible, dire situation. They were about to enter the winter in which there would be no daylight, and the weather would be awful. Their radio was too weak to send distress signal to be picked up, so they were trapped on their own. Supplies from the ship were going to quickly run out, and so they would have nothing to eat. They would have to live off the land. And so to be able to survive against all those odds seemed nearly impossible. But Shackleton had been on many expeditions. He was this brilliant man who was not just brilliant at adventuring, but he had a deep understanding of people and himself. So the first thing he realizes, in order to get out of this horrible situation, he would have to be making a series of decisions.